Today's spotlight for Black History Month is on Bayard Rustin. Bayard Rustin was probably one of the most important people in the civil rights movement in the 1950s and 60s, but a lot of people don't know who he is, and his name has been lost to history for a couple of reasons, but it's definitely one that deserves to be remembered. On today, President's Day, which was a day of protest for many, it felt right to bring up the man who is hugely instrumental in both the freedom rides and the March on Washington. And I'm going to start with a quote because it feels right. He said, "The organizers and perpetrators of segregation are as much the enemy of America as any foreign invader. And when an individual is protesting society's refusal to acknowledge his dignity as a human being, his very act of protest confers dignity on him. Protest is something that was fundamental to his philosophies, which came a lot from his upbringing. He was born in 1912 and raised by his grandparents mostly, who were Quakers. Core to the Quaker belief system, equality of all people, regardless of your race, your gender, your biological sex, your economic status. None of that matters. Everyone is equal. Another core tenet of Quakerism is nonviolence. Pacifism is the only way to move forward. They rely very heavily on their conscience as their guide. Truth is upheld above all, and the well-being of the community is forefront. All things that he will bring into his ideas of how to move social justice forward. In 1932, he decided to go to Wilberforce College, but was expelled when he organized a strike in 1936. After that, he attended Cheney State Teachers College for a few months, but he was more interested in social organizing. He went to an activist program called the American Friends Service Committee, and then he moved to Harlem in 1937 to begin studying at the City College of New York. While in New York, he became interested in the Communist Party. However, he did not stick with that because he was very much anti-war, and the Communist Party supported going to war after 1941. Then he affiliated with the Socialist Party, focused on workers' rights. In 1941, he also joined the Fellowship of Reconciliation. He became the Race Relations Secretary and helped organize a march in Washington, D.C. to protest racial segregation in the armed forces and workplace discrimination. However, the march was not needed, as President Roosevelt decided after a meeting that he would pass an executive order for fair employment in federal agencies. However, he was still a pacifist, and in 1944, he was sent to jail as a conscientious objector to the war. While there, he continued to protest many issues that he viewed as unjust and was viewed as being hard to imprison because he was never unnerved. There are even stories of him being beaten repeatedly by a white inmate until the guy just kind of gave up because Rustin didn't give him a reaction, such as the conditions of the medical care, the mail policies, and the segregation of dining facilities. When it was found out that he was a gay man in the facility, he was transferred to different institutions where he continued to fight the injustices that he saw within the system from the inside. Around this time, he helped found the Congress of Racial Equality, which was based on the principles of nonviolence and inspired by Gandhi. Since CORE was founded on the principles of Indians fighting British colonialism, he would continue to protest British colonial rule in both India and Africa, and was actually jailed a few times because of that. In 1947, he became the orchestrator of the very first freedom ride, the Journey of Reconciliation. It was a form of nonviolent, direct action to challenge state segregation laws on interstate buses in the southern part of the United States. He and 19 other men and women began in April of 1947 in Washington, D.C., and traveled as far south as North Carolina before returning back to Washington, D.C. On this ride, there were African-American passengers who would sit in the front deliberately, and then white passengers who would sit behind them deliberately. Several folks were arrested because of this, and Rustin himself spent 22 days on a chain gang in North Carolina for violating the law. However, the charges were dropped, and it was considered a success and laid the groundwork for the 1961 Freedom Rides. In the late 1940s, he spent time in Africa working to fight apartheid with the South African resistance. which later became known as the American Committee on Africa. He returned to the United States in the 1950s and unfortunately was arrested in 1953, charged with vagrancy and lewd conduct because he was caught in a relationship with a man. While he'd never hidden his sexuality, this was the first time that there was a spotlight on it. At the time, being gay was still a crime, and the conviction kind of made it hard for him to stay connected with the Fellowship of Reconciliation, so he quit that position. It also kind of limited his face within the civil rights movement. In 1955, there was a book written called Speak Truth to Power, A Quaker Search for an Alternative to Violence, and it's regarded as one of the most influential pacifist essays in the United States, but he didn't want his association with it to detract from the work itself, so he tried to stay out of the spotlight with that one. In 1956, he took a step into the civil rights movement to help Martin Luther King Jr. understand the principles of Gandhian nonviolence. At the time, King was helping organize the Montgomery bus boycott, and he wasn't so much on the nonviolence vibe, but Bayard Rustin kind of showed him that it was a possibility and something that they should attempt to do within the movement. In the late 1950s, when Rustin and King were organizing the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, many of the leaders were concerned that Rustin's sexual orientation might undermine the movement. And tensions just increased when they organized a march right around the same time as the 1960 Democratic National Convention in LA. And so when a politician threatened to leak rumors of a fake affair between Rustin and King, King decided to cancel the march because he wanted to protect his reputation, and Rustin essentially took a step back from the spotlight when it came to planning civil rights efforts. Rustin understood what was at stake, and he decided he did not want who he was as a person to detract from the good the movement was doing. However, in 1963, Rustin was needed because they wanted to organize an enormous march on Washington for jobs and freedom. And he was really the only person with the credentials to put it all together. South Carolina Senator Strom Thurmond, the chairman of the NAACP, and many others put a lot of pressure on Rustin. And so he tried to hide from the spotlight as much as possible to not let the movement lose momentum. He planned pretty much the whole thing, and while he did receive some credit, he really did not get all of the respect he deserved for what he accomplished. After the march, he continued to protest and to advocate throughout the South. He was an advisor to the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, but disagreed with how they rejected offers to work within the Democratic Party because he saw a need to work with the mainstream political parties in order to make headway. After the passing of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, he also focused on economic issues. He argued that even though there were equal rights, that until there was an equal position within the economy, that African Americans would not be able to financially compete in the society. He pushed for massive changes within our economic structure. He also continued to fight for unions and the rights of workers. He worked with the League for Industrial Democracy until the 1980s. In his later years, he became an advocate for the LGBTQIA community, testifying in favor of the New York City Gay Rights Bill, as well as advocating for people with HIV and AIDS. He did have some very interesting conservative views across time and space that seemed to conflict with his other viewpoints when it comes to the civil rights movement. But overall, all that he gave to pushing forward social justice truly cannot be replaced. He said, "Let us not be enraged about injustice, but not destroyed by it." That anger that we feel when things are wrong, that is proof that we are still humankind and that we still care about our community.